You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Cynthia Toolin-Wilson, and I'm on my radio show Author to Author with my friend Don Boland, and we're going to talk about economic science and St. Thomas Aquinas. How are you, Don?
Oh, I'm going very well, thank you.
Good, good. Would you like to start us with a prayer?
Sure. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Our Lady, Seat of Wisdom, pray for us. Amen.
Mm-hmm. So this is quite an interesting book, Don. What was it that made you decide to write it?
Well, I went to a school run by nuns as a child, and they taught us about the saints. And the saint that appealed to me most was St. Francis of Assisi.
Mm-hmm.
And what struck me about him was not only his sort of love of nature, but his embracing of poverty. That is, he wanted to not be attached to any possessions at all. Absolutely, so he could devote himself wholly to God. And of course, as a young child, that appealed to me. But with that went a concern for the poor. So from the earliest days, I had this desire to do something to help the poor. Mm-hmm. Now, that was my sort of orientation, which ultimately led me to study economics. That it was really about a concern for the way people seem to be struggling with their wealth, even though they were in a wealthy country. Everyone was poor in some sort of way. So he was the first inspiration into me, rather remote. The other saint that later on I came in contact was St. Thomas Aquinas, and they are the two saints that really have filled a large part of my life. Now, early in the piece, I didn't know much about St. Thomas Aquinas, and the only mention of his name, only awareness I had of him was the name of a nun teacher that I had, Sister Aquinas. But as I grew up in the country, I ended up in boarding school in Sydney, where I was more interested in sport than anything else. So I didn't pay much attention to serious matters. But when it came for me to decide what future I should have, I wasn't particularly clear about it. But I was one of two boys. My twin brother knew what he wanted to do, and that was to go on the land, which he did. My father was a country lawyer, and so I took up law studies. Now, I presumed that behind my thinking at that stage was that I was interested in justice, because they were the two concerns I had: a concern for the poor and a desire to to do something to remedy what I felt was an injustice.
Mm-hmm.
So I left school and decided to develop my understanding of my Catholic faith. So I began to read widely in the leading Catholic writers of the time, such as Arnold, Lunn, Belloc, and Chesterton.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time that I left school, and of course during the 20th century, there was a concern for social justice. It was very much at the centre of things, especially owing to the threat of communism. So that required a deeper study of matters economic and political. So I was sort of shifted into studying economics remotely from a concern from the poor, but then it became a central matter of concern as I left school. Mm-hmm. So I then studied the social doctrine of the Church with the social encyclicals. Mm-hmm. Now, at the end of my studies on law, I happened to learn of a Catholic adult education body called the Aquinas Academy in Sydney, Australia, run by a Marist father called Austin Woodbury. I attended that academy and became very interested in the courses given there. Coincidentally, one of the assistant teachers was a medical practitioner who had an intense interest in economic science. And so I began to study the economists from Adam Smith right up to J.M. Keynes and so on. So I became very familiar with the economic science, as well as having this sort of background in concern for justice, which was part of my Catholic understanding at that time. Mm-hmm. So the Aquinas Academy, of course, was teaching the philosophy and theology of St. Thomas Aquinas. So that was my entry into the study of St. Thomas. And it became more general. I studied St. Thomas generally, but always there was this social and moral question that centered on politics and economics. So I became most interested in applying the moral philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas and to politico-economic affairs. And as it turned out, my studies at the Aquinas Academy enabled me to gain entry into the University of St. Thomas in Rome. So as a layperson, I went to Rome and studied at the Angelicum, which is the popular name for the University of St. Thomas, for about 3 years, and eventually obtained a doctorate in philosophy.
Excellent.
But the topic of my thesis was the application of the moral philosophy and theology of St. Thomas to economic affairs. Mm-hmm. So it was a matching up of Thomistic moral doctrine, which was consonant with the social doctrine of the Church, with economics. And so the book that I've written called Economic Science and Thomas is really a summary of my ideas gained from the course of my studies then and since. So it's put into encapsulated. I mean, there's a lot more that could be said, but I tried to bring it down to the fundamental matters that needed to be addressed. So that was how I got to writing the book. The book really came out of my doctoral thesis, which I expect is the way a lot of books are written.
Oh, yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah.
So we certainly have something in common because my own background before converting was sociology, and I was very concerned with social issues, although probably from a more liberal standpoint, definitely from a more liberal standpoint. But when I converted and I became aware of Catholic social teaching, it was just like somebody flooded the room with light. And now I teach it. I teach it online for
That's right.
Holy Apostles College and Seminary.
Well, and without it, the subject matter is just so contorted and almost unintelligible. But once you have the social doctrine and the moral theology and philosophy, you can sort out all those apparent contradictions that are there. For what I discovered was how much St. Thomas had to say on these matters, and at the heart of what was discussed in modern economics, although on the surface you wouldn't think so. And he was able to throw light not only on the principles of the science, but also on the burning practical issues of the day, which and of a world that is divided into two blocks, East and West, under politico-economic systems more than anything else, communism and capitalism. And the communists claimed to be the champion of the poor and of justice for the worker. So that was an issue that had to be addressed from a Catholic point of view. It was extremely important to be able to answer those claims and refute them. As a matter of fact, they've been proved baseless historically. They just collapsed in the Soviet Union. But what I saw at the time was that even though you refuted the communists, you hadn't solved the problem of poverty and justice. So there's more to it than simply refuting communism. You had to critique your own politico-economic system to some extent anyway.
Yes.
And as a matter of fact, the solution of most questions in economics I found, and the answers to the conflicting positions of the two systems that rule the world in modern times, can actually be reduced to a small part of the summa, in the moral part. And I've identify them as the second part of the second part, questions 57 to 63, which is on distributive justice, and questions 77 and 78, which is on commutative justice, because they're the two parts of justice, social justice, that are relevant. But another thing that I found, surprisingly, was that few students of St. Thomas had picked up what I believed I had. And for English-speaking students, what I discovered was the translation wasn't the best of those parts. And in fact, and I advert to that in my book, that in important parts of the St. Thomas's treatment there. The translation is so bad that there's no wonder that what St. Thomas had to say, which I saw as so telling and relevant, was virtually hidden away. And to a certain extent, it still is. That's to do with the notion of trade. And that's something I address in my book. What about St. Thomas was even talking about the kind of trading that's done on the stock exchange, which he called negotiatio, and the English translation of a trader on the stock exchange comes across as tradesman.
Oh. That's bad. That's really bad.
So, and that's a critical distinction that St. Thomas is making there, and it'd throw anybody off.
Yeah.
Completely. So that's how I sort of brought together. Now the thing is, with poverty, it's able to be divided into two basic kinds, which is voluntary and involuntary. And of course, St. Francis is an example of voluntary poverty. That's not the economic problem. I mean, that's a religious choice which transcends the problem of poverty. Although you could describe St. Francis as an extremely poor person, he wasn't troubled by it.
No.
It's the other kind that's relevant, and that's involuntary poverty. And what I see is it's from two causes. The first is from accident or misfortune. That's from natural circumstances. You could get sick, you could have an accident, you're unable to work, etc. So, and that'll be one way you'd be rendered poor. But the other cause is less visible, and it's really from the action or inaction of our fellow human beings. Because in society we depend on others, and if they don't do the right thing, that could affect us. And so that's where I saw poverty and justice coming together, or injustice. That is, poverty is in many cases a result of injustice of human beings. And that's by far the greatest cause, as I see it, of poverty in the world. And it's the least acknowledged. And the problem with economic science is that it doesn't recognize that. It doesn't connect poverty and the failure of justice in either bad laws that favour some people rather than others and don't give everybody the right proportion of goods that they're entitled to, and that's a failure of law, or it's positively, but it can be a failure of not ensuring equality in the market place. That's so there are two areas where economic science, to me, needs to be examined and criticised. And they are to do with the two basic institutions in human society. That's institution of property. That's property is not properly proportionately given to people, and the other one is the market. So my book, therefore, examines the two kinds of justice: distributive justice, which I relate to property not being distributed the way it should be in a particular political system, so that what happens is that a few end up enormously privileged and rich, and the many are almost without any property and reduced to having to live by their labour, and not just their own labour with some capital behind it, but having to work for the people who do have property.
Yes.
So that's a characteristic of modern economic systems. So that the other one is the commutative, but there are two elements of justice: the distributive, which respects the ownership of property, and commutative, which respects equality in exchange. And because of that imbalance in possessions, there is a great disparity in the bargaining power of people in exchange. So it ends up that they can be even rendered poorer because of inequality there. So what I do is connect injustice with poverty. That's the sort of basic aim of the book, is to bring the two together and point out that modern economic science is so developed that it is treated justice as irrelevant to the study. It's become a sort of a natural scientific study of forces that are treated like natural forces within, like supply and demand and what have you, neutral social forces, when really the social relations have to be regulated by moral principles rather than natural forces.
Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking of.
So that's the sort of background to the book, and the aim of the book is to bring out that, and by just examining what St. Thomas has done in a very small part of his moral theology, but which really has great relevance to economic science, and you've got to examine. In the book, I sort of apply the distinctions he makes. One important distinction is in the market, and it goes back to Aristotle, that the economist treats the market as just one kind of exchange. So Aristotle said there are two. There's a natural exchange and what he called develops into an unnatural exchange. So there are two modes of exchange that are very opposed. One, and it all has to do with the place of money in exchange. Money is in the market. The natural function of money is as a medium of exchange.
Yeah.
But Aristotle pointed out that you can actually use it as a principle and end of exchange. That is, you don't bring goods to the market and use money and get money for them and take goods away. You can bring money to the market, buy and sell at a profit. And, what you take out of the market is money. So I explain that distinction and how it's relevant to understanding the modern economy. There's a huge amount of this secondary kind of exchange that goes on, and unfortunately, if you're adept at it, you can become rich pretty quickly. But St. Thomas says it has to be orientated to their natural needs. But of itself, it's got no sort of control over it. That's once you get into that mode of trying to use the market to increase your money, the desire for money is without limit. And that can lead to all sorts of social problems.
Yes.
Right, so I examine. So I apply those principles to the actual facts of economic life and come to certain judgments about it, what is happening there, and showing how with these insights of St. Thomas you can judge what's wrong with communism, and you can apply certain criticisms to capitalism. Communism is much worse than capitalism, but capitalism is not without its faults, and they can be fairly serious faults. And economic science sort of is unable to deal with those faults. And it tries to explain the modern capitalist system in neutral terms. And so there are plenty of sort of side issues there. One that I address is that modern economic science, instead of making justice its principle, it makes freedom the basic principle of economic behaviour. And but freedom is necessary. So it's an important part of human interaction, for it's what differentiates human moral behaviour from natural physical activity. And that's the paradoxical thing about economic science. There's a sort of a inconsistency at the heart of it. It's treating the system as running naturally like a machine, and yet it's explaining it in terms of freedom. But once you introduce freedom, you've got to introduce morality, and you've got to regulate things by moral principles. And in the social order, that first principle is, and the first virtue is justice. So without justice, you can't explain or deal with human behaviour. And justice. Freedom is freedom from justice. So, and that's a very dangerous thing.
It is. I agree.
To elevate freedom above justice. Freedom is a necessary part of human behaviour. And it's fundamental. But without justice, it's not human. You're not dealing with human behaviour.
Right.
You're introducing motivations that can be almost diabolical. You absolute freedom from, and of course that ties in with the mood of the age, which dispenses with the author of the moral law. So it tends to go with an irreligious view of things.
Yes, almost, yeah.
Yeah, so that's and the way that poverty is associated with that is that without justice, one section of the community is able to exploit the other. It's able to take advantage of various privileges and even natural advantages, and use those advantages to deprive others of their rightful proportion of wealth, and then to take advantage even in the market, because they're able to use a great inequality of bargaining power to get more out of the market than they give in, that they put in. Yeah, so that's a rough sort of view of what I've been trying to do in the book.
So two things were occurring to me while you were talking.
Yeah. The only thing I would add is that in order to correct the involuntary poverty caused by the faults in the understanding of the economic order, we've got to restore distributive justice in regard to property, and ensure the commutative justice in the market. And that requires an understanding of what justice is, which is to be found quite readily if you know where it is and you can get a good translation in a small part of St. Thomas's treatment of justice, but a central part. So that's what I would say.
So while you were talking, there were two things that occurred to me. One of which is when we talk about property, here, I assume in much of the world, intellectual property is becoming very important.
Sure.
And I see where what you're saying could apply even there, because people do not have equal access to education, quality
definitely,
education.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a point made in one of the social encyclicals, the latest ones.
Yeah.
To think of property, it's not just material property that you have to address, but the imbalance in in the distribution of intellectual property, and even of technological skills and all that, and knowledge. So knowledge is a very important. And if you don't have a proper notion of the right of property there, that can be a means of taking advantage of others.
Yes.
And also there's another principle that all the goods of the earth, even your own intellectual advantages, are for the good of everybody.
Yes.
That's the universal destination. That's another principle that's not really adhered to, is that you've got to use your property. You can't use it solely for your own benefit. You've got to use it for the benefit of the common good.
Yes.
And which means that you've got to distribute it freely, where you don't really require an excess of advantage from it. There should be a tendency for the property to be universally distributed. But that is an important point, that the great inequality that the West has over the rest, as it were, is the scientific and technological possessions it has, which is so. But that's part of the problem of poverty of property, which impacts on a lot of people not having advantage of property.
Absolutely.
And of course, I mean, these are just questions of justice.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to, from a Christian point of view, you've got greater obligations in charity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In this country, I was born poor, so I can relate to this. I was born in the underclass. But when I look at what's going on in this country now, with the race issue, and which has come to the forefront in very, very violently. It's terrible.
That's right. Well, the way I see that is that what tends to happen is the core, the basic inequality, which is not racial. It's more in terms of a few privileged, and the many who are sort of without property, or much property, and are required really to sell their labour, as it were, or to work for others. And so you've got a disproportionate number of privileged people who own the property and don't have to work, and the rest of them who without the property have to be employed by them. So that's but that's got nothing to do with race. That's got to do with a problem of social justice generally. But unfortunately, in the course of history, the ones who are sort of well placed at the beginning, and when new people come in, migrants come in, they tend to settle at the lowest level first anyway. They might make their way up afterwards. But like the Irish were the poorest at the beginning. They came from a poor country, but you wouldn't regard them as racially discriminated.
No.
And the blacks have a special problem because they started out with an injustice in terms of a legal injustice. But and I think there's that general animus against the inequality that's there, but it's then distracted from the real problem by identifying it with a particular race. So I think it's not a racial problem, but it's being made into one for some devious reasons, maybe.
Discrimination. It is discrimination and prejudice. I don't think there's any doubt of that, but it is. When we think of intellectual property or even the ability to just get a good education, do not. Regardless of race, there's going to be a distribution.
No, and see if you're looking at the country generally, the majority of people have no. They're in the same boat, as it were, as whether you're black or Irish or German or whatever you are, but. I mean, this is where the problem of the opposition between communism and capitalism comes in, is that it's a sort of a diversionary tactic, I think, to identify it with a particular group. So as to take attention away from the real injustice that's there that you should be correcting.
I understand what you're saying. So
and it gets very once you bring race into it, it becomes very emotional and violent. But that suits some people's agenda. And that's the problem. Is until you identify the real cause of injustice and inequality, any other proposed target will lead to conflict and irrational behaviour, which is a sad thing, because then you don't solve the problem; it remains. You're just fighting one another.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's a real sad thing. But it's a deep problem because there are people who, who are ideologically driven to destroy the system itself. It's like when you've got a headache, you've got a real headache, and somebody comes along and says, "Well, I can solve your problem. I'll cut your head off."
Yeah, that's not good.
That's the irrationality of their attitude. They don't really, but they don't have the fundamental understanding of justice. I just use the word, and then associated with race, which has got nothing to do with. There's plenty of white people who are being unjustly poor.
Yes. Yes. I agree, but I think because of some social structures of sin, which involve racism and class, that that there is more going on.
Well, yeah. I mean, there will be people who are motivated that way, or who consider themselves superior because they have a better education, and they've got advantages which they don't recognise as not from them but from others.
Yeah.
So you've got that sort of egoistic attitude with you attribute your superiority to yourself. You may have it, but it's like what St. Paul says. Why do you boast? What you have, you've received. So and they don't. And if you received it, you should be grateful and want to pass it on to other people. But
yes.
So there's that psychological and moral problem as well.
Yeah.
But the social issue, I think, has to be addressed in terms of the categories of justice, like distributive justice and commutative justice, and that's what the current science doesn't solve, and it can't solve.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you've given us a lot to think about, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, hopefully I can direct some people to St. Thomas's treatment, specifically on those points, but unfortunately, it's necessary also to correct the translations. You could only really get the right understanding of what St. Thomas is saying there, I think, if you have the Latin.
Yeah.
You can't, because he uses terms which have come into English in a transformed way. Like he uses a word for what is a merchant or a wheeler and dealer in property or something like that. That is where you just use money to buy and sell and make a profit that way. And it's translated as tradesman.
Yeah. Which has an entirely different connotation in English.
Well, it's the opposite. But
exactly.
Because we are sort of imbued with the idea that the market involves one kind of activity. But St. Thomas is saying there are two basic kinds of activity in trading. And you use the same word, trade, but they have opposite meanings. A trader on the stock exchange is not the same as a plumber.
No, not at all.
Or the fellow who's making shoes and selling them. So the difference is there is natural course is to provide commodities or goods for the market, get money for them, and buy the goods that you need. So you go into the market with your own goods, and you come out with others' goods that you could now use. Whereas the other kind of trade is where you don't bring any goods in, you bring money into the market, and you buy and sell. And from the nature of the fact that prices are not fixed, they move.
Yeah.
And if you're astute, you can scrape off, as it were, a profit simply by And buying anything, buying land, but the ordinary person buys a house in order to live in it. But you can be a person who buys and sells houses because of a rising price movements, which can be sort of ordinary or due to bad economic conditions, or due to immigration coming in, the prices go up. And if you're clever, you can see, well, that's good. I can buy, and a year or so later it'll risen by 20%. So I sell and collect the difference. So that's a quite different kind of use of money.
Yes, it is.
It's not necessarily immoral, but it has to be controlled by your needs, not by your desire for money. That's a distinction that goes right back to Aristotle, which doesn't come into the science of the modern market. And in fact, the tendency is to think of the market as just a case of making money. So, and there again, that skill is another reason for some people being able to make their way better than others. See, the ordinary poor person, he just wants to have a house. He's not going to be wheeling dealing. But the person who's got a fair bit of money will make more. But I mean, St. Thomas gives the distinctions, but he doesn't apply them. He can't apply them to modern conditions. But they're very relevant to them.
Yes. I agree.
Okay, so it's quite a merry-go-round where we find that the present state of affairs. But I mean the solution is there if we can. I mean, it's one thing to know what to do, another thing to be able to implement it, of course, to get it across to people who have the power to change things. So it's and of course from a natural point of view, you can't hope to get very far. It becomes a supernatural problem.
Yes.
You got to bring in the angels. If you're going to get anywhere, but okay, so I thank you, Cynthia, for your kind offer.
Oh, I'm fascinated by what you said, especially since I teach Catholic social teaching. It's like this is very interesting to me.
Yeah, but as I see it, I mean, from my experience, the Catholic social teaching hasn't really grasped fully what St. Thomas is saying at critical points. I mean, it makes all the right decisions and criticism of communism, but part of the problem is the dominance of communism in the thinking of the Catholic mind.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And therefore, we haven't paid enough attention to our own backyard, as it were.
Yes. Yes.
And just what may be out of line there.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously there's something wrong.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
They're not working properly, and so we've got enough ammunition against communism, but and that is in accord with St. Thomas's moral teaching on property and justice.
Mm-hmm.
But we haven't looked into our own soul, as it were, social soul.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and we need to bring that to the forefront. I mean, but unfortunately, the whenever anybody sort of gets close to the nerve there, the spectre of communism is raised.
You're right. Yes, I agree.
And interesting enough, the present Pope, who I think is really on the money there in the social order, but he cops a lot of criticism from the West, because they think he's slipping into the opposite extreme. They think he's favouring socialism or communism even.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
but I find that what he says is pretty right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. A lot of people here don't care for him.
No, yeah, but and on he is sort of somebody who rides on the margin of things, and but I think one of the basic reasons for that is really from his position on poverty. That is, he's thinking of the poor and the problems that they have with coping with these moral questions. That's, like what he probably got into over the divorce and remarried people.
Thinking of that, yeah.
Well, strictly speaking, of course, they cannot have access to the sacraments. But then he sort of introduced a sort of a prudential question. He says, leave it to the person on the ground, as it were, the priest who has to make the decision. He won't rule for or against it. But I think that he's thinking of just how difficult it is for an ordinary poor person who is married and remarried, and he's raising a family here and there, and he's just excluded from the church, not totally, but from the sacraments. And in a lot of cases, I'm not wanting to go into this issue, but in a lot of cases, it's he doesn't know whether he's properly married or not. Anyway, so but that's another issue. But I think on the social doctrine, the present Pope has taken it a step further than the previous ones. That is, the previous ones are focusing on the threat of socialism and communism because they came out of that society.
Right.
But he's come from a country that is not all that favourable to the to the West and the capitalist system, and he's willing to point the finger at us, as it were.
Yeah. Well, the Holy Spirit sends who He wants. He sends the person we need.
Yeah.
And I tell that frequently when I hear criticism of him. It's like, do you think that, if he's the Pope and the Holy Spirit put him there? I mean, are you saying somebody else put him there, not the Holy Spirit, right? It's, to me, that's as basic as it gets.
Yeah, that's right. I think in terms of the popes, it's providential, the ones they get. Mm-hmm. They just seem to bring something needed at the time.
Yes. And that is definitely the work of the Spirit.
Yeah. So we've got to have a bit more faith. Stronger faith.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I want to thank you for giving me this interview, and I think we meet at the same time next Thursday night.
My Friday morning at the same time. I'm glad it worked very easily. I was a bit apprehensive that I wouldn't be able to hook in.
It worked fine. And I really enjoyed our talk.
Yeah, no, well, it is a very important area, and a lot of thinking to be done in it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, Cynthia. We'll I'll call you up next Friday.
Next Thursday. Oh, yes, your Friday. I'm sorry. I've got to stop saying Thursday.
Your Thursday.
My Thursday. Yes. Okay, and thank you again.
Okay, Cynthia. Thanks for talking to you.
Yeah, you take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
To a production of WCAT Radio, please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up where knowledge takes flight.